Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker for this afternoon, Victor Davis Hanson, who's a fellow at the Hoover Institute. He writes regularly for Pajamas Media, a syndicated columnist. Many of you know him and know of his great writings. He won the National Humanities Medal in 2007 during the administration of George W. Bush. He's a great friend of the American Freedom Alliance, and he was the keynote speaker actually 5 years ago when we did a conference exactly in this spot. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Victor Davis Hanson.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. You're sort of guinea pigs. 4 weeks ago I had an accident and had some facial problems and concussion, so whether I'm sane or not will be your judgment. What was the idea of a university in the West, and the Western concept of education and its relationship to a constitutional society? Yes. Essentially, in ancient Greece and classical Rome, we get these words: education, educare, or campus, an open field where people could meet, or the Lyceum of Aristotle's school, or Plato's academy. And essentially, the idea of a university was not diversity. It wasn't to separate people, much less to separate them by ideology or race, class, or gender, but to bring in all sorts of disciplines and to have a common core experience for a limited number of time in the youth or the collective youth of the society. And the idea was that, in theory, then people would become educated and then they could participate in the heavy responsibilities of the Athenian ecclesia or the Roman Republic, the Florentine Republic, the Venice Republic, our own republic. And the idea of education was literal, educare. It was to lead somebody from one place, X, out of it to another. And if I could summarize what the university was, it was based on two simple principles. One, that students had to have a shared body of knowledge to be active participatory citizens, and that you needed a council of elders, a faculty senate, wise people who had greater experience and knowledge that could set this curriculum. And if everybody had these common core of knowledge, and it could be the ability to tell a Corinthian column from a Doric column, the ability to know what a mixed constitution was, or a tripartite constitution, or to know what Dante was about, or what's the difference between Euripides and Homer. Not in depth, but at least enough reference so that they could draw on these points to do what? To think inductively. So the second part of the university in the classical sense was, we are not going to have presupposed thoughts, predetermined thoughts, and then make examples fit. We're going to look at the world around us empirically, and we're going to bring these facts and figures and science and math and languages, and then we're going to process that information and come to an inductive conclusion. And we're going to be disinterested about it. If our students leave the university as Marxist or even fascist, we're concerned, but we can't prevent that. We don't try to mold the mind, or we don't try to ensure a predetermined result. That was pretty much, with ups and downs, peaks and valleys, the American university system in line with the tradition in Western civilization till about 1965. Now, what happened? Well, at some point, coterminous with these great social upheavals in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of the Vietnam War, a generation that had grown up not going through the Depression, not having to serve in World War II, but grown up by parents who had to do that and did not want their children to suffer as they did. It was, to be candid, the baby boomers were the most affluent and leisured generation in the history of civilization. And when they came onto the campus, they felt that the slow, incremental change that had always characterized Western civilization, which is the only civilization in the world that embraced the idea of self-criticism. It was too slow. The United States was not perfect, and therefore it was not good. And just as the new technology and the new affluence and the new wealth gave unforeseen possibilities and opportunities, so this generation could come to campus, it could stop the Vietnam War, it could make us equal in terms of gender and race and class, and we could do it instantaneously if only we understood what the university was really for. It could not be disinterested. It could not be inductive. Now, why could it not? Because in their view, society itself was biased. Society had on its side the corporation. Society had traditional religion. Society had government. Society had tradition and protocol. Society had the nuclear family. Society had the white heterosexual male patriarchy. And therefore, there was no other institution to challenge that. So the university would step into this void and enact social change. And it did not have to be balanced, because on campus it was a refuge from the biases and the unfairness all around it. And so the university, by being unfair, or by having one particular view of radical egalitarianism, if you want to call it that, or social mobilization, or quality result, whatever term we prefer to use, it would be balancing all of the other reactionary and illiberal institutions. And as this process accelerated, it also accelerated with the largest, let's face it, in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, we had the largest economic growth in the history of the United States and the history of the world. We created levels of technological sophistication and material affluence that no civilization in history had ever experienced. And the university grew, and it grew more and more, I guess we could use the term deductive. And it felt that it had a mission to enact social change, and it did not have to be balanced, or at least empirical. And here we are today, where just this last year we've seen everybody from Hirsi Ali to Condoleezza Rice, people who have grown up under enormous challenges, whether it's the Jim Crow South or Hirsi Ali fighting the extremism of Sharia law, and they are considered illiberal. They're part of the establishment. And who are they considered illiberal by? By a very affluent, self-anointed group of people who feel that they're avatars of social change, and they do not have to be empirical. The other things that are just absolutely inexplicable about this new university that we've been dealing with the last 30 years. Tenure, for example, that was a noble idea originally in Western civilization, that we were going to take eccentrics, free thinkers, people who were empirical. We were going to put them on this classical campus, and we were going to allow students for 4 years to encounter them, to think, to experiment, to adopt ideologies and cast them off, and then they were going to go out and participate in constitutional government. Nobody in their right mind thought that this generation would come in and interpret tenure as a gift, manna from heaven, that would allow them to replicate themselves. So now we've degenerated into a situation, not only can we not have a particular graduation speaker, but the faculties are 90 to 95% ideologically homogeneous. So when I was at California State University, we would get the most extraneous topics. Should we have gay marriage in 1996 in California? And then the plebiscite among the faculty senate would be analogous to Saddam Hussein's Iraq. It would be 99-2, usually Bruce Thornton and myself. And this was considered to be fair and empirical because society itself around us was unfair. Another thing that came up in this ends can justify any means necessary, the university did not become transparent. You think that liberal people who embody self-critique would be happy to divulge their statistical analysis of how people do in school, or I mean, we don't even know Barack Obama's transcript from Columbia, much less Occidental, but people became very secretive. It's almost more secretive than the elders in Venice during the Republic. So what I meant by that was that when I came in, for example, to Cal State University, Fresno, in 1984, the remediation rate was, remediation is a fancy administrative word for people who cannot do university work when they arrive because of a defective high school education. They have not tested, or they do not have the grades to do basic English and math. They're admitted provisionally, and they have a year to make that up. That was 34% of the CSU system, largest system in the world, remember. 250,000 students at that time. We could not get information who was being admitted that had to be remediated, why they were being admitted. It was not disclosed. Today, the remediation rate at CSU system is about 57 to 58%. So half the students in California that are in the CSU system, the largest system in the world, are not, they would not be there under the guidelines that the system had originally been envisioned as. Over the period that I was a professor there, the administrative cast increased by about 200%, and the faculty by about 3%. So there had to be a technocracy as the university metamorphosized beyond its original role of disinterested inquiry and empiricism, common collective core knowledge. It began to do things that were necessary for social change. So that meant at a typical CSU campus, you would have an office of migrant education. You have an office of disabled students. You would have a center for gender studies. You would have a center for Latino studies. You would have an African American library. You would have a union office. And all of these required technocrats and secretaries. And the number of people who were not teaching soared to over 50% of the personnel. So there became a technocracy that was invested in this new social organism. It grew almost as if it was an amoeba. It was not transparent. It institutionalized tenure in a way that had never been envisioned before. And the third thing that was so disturbing was the change in the curriculum. Now, over the period, say, from about 1975, we had this new, in the last 40 years, we had this hyphenated studies. So if you were interested in the environment, you were taught conservation perhaps in a biology class. If you were interested in Rosie the Riveter, that would come up under enlightened teaching during World War II. But nobody had envisioned that you would have a class called Chicano Studies, Environmental Studies, Gay Studies, Leisure Studies, Peace Studies. And these were very important because it wasn't just that they were sins of commission, they were sins of omission in the zero-sum curriculum. So for each class like that, some other class was taken out. We know what those some other classes were. They were primarily political and military diplomatic history, classical literature, anything that at least was not subject to an instant politicalization and could not demonstrate a need, an anthropological, sociological, psychological need in society. And this was brought home to me when I gave a talk about 10 years at University of California, Santa Barbara, to a very hostile audience. I just in passing said, there's not one class at this great university campus in the Civil War. And people were stunned, and a faculty member got in the back and waved the catalog at me. And I said, do you have a problem? It was right in the middle of the lecture. She said, there is too, you're lying. I said, would you name the class? And she said, Race and Gender and Reconstruction South. Well, that's not the campaigns of General Grant or the March through Georgia or the causes of the Civil War. So there was something lost. And even when some of us on general education committees would complain about this, we'd say we need more classes in French literature. That was not a remedy either, because you found out that survey of French literature was really deconstruction of Michel Foucault. So whatever the rubric was, there was a mechanism to insert a class that would be A, specialized and reflect the narrow interest of this new generation of academic, because they were not broad generalists. They were political activists. So whether it was tenure or the curriculum or the lack of transparency, we morphed into what we have now, what we've heard in this conference. So what's so bad about it? It seems to me there's two or three things that, at least in an iconoclastic fashion, that I don't like about it. I know you have your pet peeves. The first is that it's hypocritical. And it mirror images what's happened to the United States. We have created, in place of the Democratic Party, an elite liberal technocracy. Somebody like Barack Obama, who lectures this, or Ms. Warren, the senator from Massachusetts, lectures us about the evils of the 1%, but then have a household income of $1.6 million in her case, or they can't vacation without going to Martha's Vineyard. And the idea is that because, like the medieval practice of exemption, if you profess that you're hip or cool and you're a participant in popular culture, or that you're left-wing and progressive, that is sort of like going to a bishop in 16th century Rome and saying, you know, I want to donate 1 block to the Dome of St. Peter's and then I can continue to be a moneylender, or whatever my particular sin is. It's almost a formal contract. So we have academics today who rail at the corporation, especially the disparity between the CEO and the entry-level worker. And yet, if you look at the average wage per class of part-time teaching, it's gone up about 1% in the last 15 years, whereas the university presence has gone up about 58%. So we have this ridiculous situation of college presence at Ohio State, $3.5 million, CSU presence making $500,000, railing about inequality in society when they're hiring people, 48% of all units at CSU at $3,000 class. That was epitomized most dramatically, as you remember, by Paul Krugman. He recently announced that he was leaving Princeton. In his retirement, he would be teaching at the City University of New York, and he would be studying inequality as a Regents professor. The only problem was that he was studying inequality as a professor without teaching 1 class. He was getting $225,000, so he was getting 75 times more salary than the people who taught 1 class there, which was 1 more class than he taught. It was quite striking. Or Joseph Stiglitz, the great economist who studies inequality, who recently announced that he demands $40,000 a speech. Personally, I can remember that when I was at Cal State Fresno, we had a president who could not write a memo, and I mean this literally, without reminding us that we live in a racially and class and gender diverse society in the Fresno County area, and how wonderful that was, and how happy he was to be from the East Coast and get to enjoy this rich cultural milieu, he would say. He did this for 20 years. Every hiring, every policy decision was calibrated in race, class, and gender. And then one day he retired, and he announced the next day that he had built a $4 million home in Rancho Mirage and he was leaving. And he's there today. And so what I suggest is that part of the problem with academia, it was a catalyst for the greater problem that we see throughout the Democratic Party and the liberal elite, that it's almost a psychological mechanism that people adopt hyper-liberalism as a way, whether you're Al Gore and your carbon footprint is astronomical, or you're the Steyer brothers and you rail against private money corrupting things as you infuse 50 million, or whatever the particular sin is. It's a psychological mechanism for a lot of people in academia to make a lot of money, to have a lot of tenure, to have a lot of perks, and not to feel guilty about it because they feel they're on the barricades of social progressive change. So that's one thing that's very disturbing, to see these professors talk about granite counters and hardwood floors and the latest Volvo SUV, why they go into the classroom and then tell working kids that they're part of a patriarchy or a white privilege. It doesn't connect anymore. It's almost embarrassing. The second thing that I really don't like about the university anymore, and I think you don't either, is that we have reduced history to cardboard caricatures. What do I mean by that? When you say that the Civil War is Harriet Tubman or Rosie the Riveter represents World War II, we say that all those people who died in Okinawa, 12,000 of them, 50,000, read E.B. Sledge with the Old Breed on Okinawa, they're nothing anymore. Or the tens of thousands of people who came out on the Oregon Trail, they got typhus, they got malaria, they got yellow fever, they endured horrific deprivations to found Oregon and California. They don't no longer exist anymore. We go back as if we are picking winners and losers in history, as if it's some melodramatic game, not a tragedy. This guy's good because he's a person of color. She's okay. She's a woman. This guy was a cowboy who we found out was gay. He's okay. And then these are the bad guys. They killed Indians. They desecrated the environment. But what's terrible about it is, first of all, we don't give any latitude for the human experience. They were wonderful people. And second, this process is all occurring in a material and psychological and political context that these people gave us. Nobody wants to go to Angola and do this. Nobody wants to attack the United States from the UN and move the UN to Guatemala. So what I'm saying is these professors are the dividend of thousands of lives, millions of lives of people who sacrificed to do what? To give us the material bounty and the freedom of expression that they count on as second nature. It was brought home to me in a conversation I had around 1995 with a faculty member and said, "You have white privilege." I said, "No, I don't." And I said, "Why?" I said, "Well, I had ancestors that came from Sweden. They got off the boat." "Well, you have to have some slave owner." I said, "Well, my maternal grandmother, they had nothing. They took the Intercontinental Railroad. They got into a wagon. They found at Fresno the ash tree. It wasn't even existing then. They got there in 1871. 2 of them died from typhoid. They pitched a tent where my house is today. They had no bathroom, no electricity. There was a pond, and they lived there in a little hovel for 3 years. And then they had a eucalyptus. They planted eucalyptus. They had some seeds from Australia. 10 years later, they were using the bark to make another little hovel, and they went hovel to hovel till in 1874 they built the house that I live in. And she said to me, "But where was that grandmother from?" I said, "I think from New Mexico." "Well, where was she from?" I said, "Well, her father was from Alabama." "Oh, so you have slave owners in your family." In other words, you could negate all of that suffering and all of the good that all those generations did because of some abstract concept, and an abstract concept that was advanced from somebody who was very wealthy, and it depended on all of those values that our ancestors brought, which were what? Constitutional government, free market capitalism, the sanctity of private property. So here we have created this strange thing, this academic that goes to these beautiful campuses such as we're on today, speaks freely, drives a wonderful car, and then critiques the very system that created all of the things he takes as second nature. And yet worse, to get back to my earlier point about the hypocrisy, the technocracy, never lives out the abstractions that he advances. He's always immune from the ramifications of his own ideology. It's the most crazy thing in the world. Former Chancellor UC Berkeley, who was also a very liberal guy, Robert Bergen, who was not disinvited as a commencement address. When he arrived in Berkeley, he said, "One of my goals is to challenge Prop 209 and to make the UC Berkeley campus ethnically diverse." Well, I don't know how a Canadian from Toronto would know about the ethnic diversity of California, but he thought he did. And then I wrote an article in critique of him. He discovered very quickly that the number of white citizens in California and the number of white citizens at the UC Berkeley campus was disproportionate by about 4%. They were underrepresented. Yes, Chicanos and blacks were underrepresented, but Asians were overrepresented. I don't like those words under, over. Who cares whether Berkeley's 100% Asian if it's meritocratic? So what he was basically telling people, but he was intellectually dishonest, was I want to come here and I want to have some type of quota to reduce the number of Asian students so I can mechanically somehow create this diversity, which I will be immune from myself as a white male. He should have resigned and said there's too many white males, I want a black chancellor. So that's the second thing that I think all of us don't like, that is the hypocrisy and the reduction of individuals in history and tragedies in history to superficial Saturday night melodrama, all orchestrated and directed by a pretty sorry cast of characters in the university. There's a third, and this is a pet peeve of mine, and that is military history. History didn't exist apart from military history in its origins. Name any historian of antiquity, Thucydides, Herodotus, Polybius, Livy, Xenophon, Tacitus. History was war because they felt, whether it wasn't that they liked war, they no more liked war than brain surgeons liked brain tumors. But they studied these pathologies and they thought that there were certain moments in the human experience that for good or evil were more important than other moments. The Battle of Kursk in 1943, in that greatest tank battle of all time, that was a little bit more important each second by second, and it affected a few more million people than whether this California legislature was voting on transgendered restrooms. I'm sorry, but every moment in history is not equal, and military history reminds us of that. And that was a way of studying U.S. history, world history, so that when we had this common core and we had this body of professors who were disinterested, we studied military history. So we have the 70th anniversary of D-Day this week. Does anybody believe that American students who graduate know anything about George S. Patton or the Third Army? Do they know why we happened to invade in 1944 and June 6 and not 1942 or not 1945? They have any idea what the strategy about D-Day was about? No. If you ask them, what do you know about World War II? They know nothing. They don't know any military history. There are 4 recognized military history programs in the United States where you can get a major, and there's 230 at last count peace studies program. Think of that. So the idea is that we can stop war by telling people not to go to war. We've done that for 2,500 years. There's no record that it's ever worked. So what is military history? Really, it's to tell us why people destroy each other in insane fashion, and they do it, unfortunately, toward a general logic. And the logic is when you lose deterrence, when there's a lack of balance of power, when wars are inconsequential, they go on, and what causes peace? Basically, peace is a parenthesis, like Plato. It's a very rare period in human experience. So what keeps a peace are armed deterrence, alliances, balance of power. What keeps peace? Defeating the enemy as quickly as possible and not having a bellum interrupt him. But these are the essentials of Western military history, and they've absolutely disappeared from the modern curriculum. Now, what does all this do? I promised you in the talk, what does all this do about the future of the United States? Take foreign policy. If you have a group of elites, Ben Rhodes is Assistant National Security Advisor, or Samantha Power, or Susan Rice, and they are products, not just products, but they are the epitome, the winners of this system, then you shouldn't expect necessarily that they have a knowledge of the Treaty of Versailles, or they know who George Marshall was, or they know what Harry Truman envisioned in the post-war period. So what we are seeing now, and of course the citizenry, which is uneducated, has no ability or is in no position to critique them, we're seeing the unraveling of the post-world order. Remember, after World War II, some wise men, whatever your particular political affinities are, some wise men, Democratic and Republican, decided that they were not going to have a World War III, they were not going to have a Versailles Treaty, they were going to go in and physically occupy Germany, and they were going to create something called NATO, and they were going to contain Soviet communism, and for the more idealistic, they were going to build the United Nations, but they were going to make the United States strong and engaged, and out of that system, you would have freedom of communications, you would have freedom of trade, freedom of commerce, national boundaries would be more or less recognized, there would be a chance for prosperity, there would be some anomalies in the system. The first anomaly is, what do you do with Germany? It's caused 3 wars, 1871, 1914, 1940. You were going to occupy it, and you were going to try to manifest German dynamism within the confines of economic power, political influence, but not military. Therefore, something very strange would happen. It wouldn't have nuclear power, nuclear weapons. France, a much weaker country, and Britain would. And the same was true in Asia with Japan. Japan would not have nuclear weapons. And out of that weird system, we got globalization and prosperity. So we get a whole new entourage of university, our best and brightest out of the Ivy League, and Barack Obama is sort of emblematic of what we've been talking about. And the first thing he wants to do is negotiate a radical reduction in nuclear weapons, because he thinks nuclear weapons are very dangerous. They are, and that the Soviet Union, which has nothing to do with our responsibilities toward Japan and the Pacific or to Europe, we start promising that we're going to build down to 1,500 deployable nuclear weapons and down to 500. And all of a sudden, as we're witnessing the last month, people are very shocked. South Korea says, we can make nuclear weapons and they'll work like Kias. They won't work like North Koreans. And Japan says, we could make nuclear weapons. We have enough plutonium to make 4,000 of them. Taiwan says, we can make them. Philippines can make them. Australia. But they don't make them because we have this enormous arsenal and we guarantee their security. So when we unilaterally start to discuss it, that we're upsetting the entire post-world order that they don't have anything about. So when we tell Europe that we're going to get out of Europe and pivot, It's okay to pivot, but you have to take something and put it somewhere. When you don't take, there's not much to take anymore, and there's not much to put anymore, then you're telling the Europeans, I don't know what the status of NATO is, but we're going to negotiate a decline in nuclear weapons. And you know what? You might have to revert back to the way Europe was in the 20th century, which is a total disaster. But all of those considerations are completely absent. Another thing that happens when you have a citizenry that is ignorant of history, the United States for all the critiques against it, it's a very irrational foreign policy. I know we've done a lot of bad things, but my gosh, we're about the only country in the world that from time to time makes decisions that are not based on our own necessary rational interest. So we do things like take out Saddam, but we stay there and try to create a utopian constitutional government. And the result is, for all the agonies of Iraq, you have 7 million Kurds that actually have an amazing society, and their existence is predicated on U.S. engagement. We have 7 million people in Israel who create more gross national product than everybody in North Africa put together, and their existence is predicated on an implied assurance from the United States. We have Taiwan, by any measure of real politics, should not exist. However nebulous our guarantees to Taiwan are there. And we get an historically ignorant, idealistic, arrogant, narcissistic group of people to come in with all sorts of degrees, and we are told that, well, we're going to negotiate with China, we're going to reset with Russia, and all of a sudden these countries doubt now whether we're going to protect them. And let me just sum up is that we've tried this before, because there's outbursts, periods in American history where the university sort of explodes on the scene. Jimmy Carter, remember, came in 1977, and he predicated his foreign policy on two things. Human rights would adjudicate most of his decisions abroad, and he had no inordinate fear of communism. It was wonderful. I was a student at the time. Everybody loved Jimmy Carter. Got away from this Kissinger, realpolitik, Cold War, saber rattling, Vietnam, etc. It worked pretty well until people had sized up the world around them. And all of a sudden, in the annus terribilis of late 1979, early 1980, Soviets invaded Afghanistan, hostages were taken in Iran, fall of the Shah, communist insurrections all through Central America, China invades Vietnam. I could go on and on. And what was that all about? It was about somebody who was ignorant of the past, and people around him who were ignorant of the past, who was a utopian that said, if the United States is not perfect, it's not good. And within about 2 years, he destroyed the world order. But unlike this present administration, he did self-correct. The Carter Doctrine, a vast increase in 1980 in the defense budget. This president, whether we look at reset with Russia, bomb, not bomb against Syria, unilaterally telling our allies, I have a new approach to Iran to stop its proliferation, supposedly, lead from behind in Libya. I don't know what our policy is toward China, but it's disturbing. The allies, as I said earlier, don't feel that they're part and parcel of the U.S. nuclear umbrella. And the result is that we are now sitting on a volcano where we're back to 1979 or 80, and certain regional hegemonies, whether it's China or Iran or Russia, feels that it's time to make certain regional adjustments while there is somebody in office who does not represent the post-war American-led global order and is not really convinced that the United States is an exceptional country, both at home with its tradition of free market economics, equality of opportunity, and self-critique. And so we're now in a crisis. I'll just finish by suggesting that societies go through this when they get into a sort of a collective hysteria or collective madness. One good example, I'll just give you two. One good example was Britain after World War II. Think of 1945. Britain had been enormously successful in production. We think America was so productive, it was, but little old Britain produced more tanks and aircraft in World War II than Nazi Germany, who had all of the present EU under its control. It's phenomenal. So the war ends. There is no China miracle yet. There is no Japanese. We firebombed 65% of the Japanese cities, Hiroshima. It's all over with. There's no Japan. There's no Germany. Occupied France has had 30% of its industrial base wasted. There's no tigers in Thailand or Vietnam. India doesn't exist. There's only 2 countries in the world. Russia has lost 20 million people. Nazis have occupied all of its 65% of its industrial area for 3.5 years. There's the United States, and there's Britain. Britain has this phenomenal record of production during World War II, and the world suddenly needs what? Tankers, ships, appliances, heavy trucks, steel, everything. And where are they going to get it? From the United States. And they get it from the United States. And what does Britain have to offer? Well, it decides to nationalize its trains, nationalize its steel industry, nationalize its healthcare, nationalize its transportation. And within 15 years, places that were completely in ruins, whether it's Frankfurt or Yokohama, are producing more goods and services in Britain. Was that fated? No, it was a decision made by historically ignorant people who felt that they had reached a certain point in their development. They were successful after World War II, and now they were going to do something that there was no empirical evidence that it ever worked. We didn't do that at that particular time, and we say, my final example is, I'll go back in history a little bit, when societies become, I guess the term is they go rogue, or they go insane, or they lose their historical bearings. There was no reason why Athens, the city-state, had to cease to exist as an independent entity in the 4th century BC. They had existed for 180 years. They had dealt with people who came from the north. Xerxes, 480, invades with 170 to 250,000 Persians. A very small city-state of Athens, no more than 150,000 people. Only 17 allies. They defeat them at Salamis. The next year with the Spartans, they defeat them at Plataea. Very poor Greece defeated a very wealthy Persia. Fast forward to the Battle of Chaeronea. We have invaders from the north coming again. They're not 150,000. They're not kings. They're Philip of Macedon, a bunch of backward Macedonians. At the Battle of Chaeronea, they extinguished Greek liberty. How could that be possible? Well, you look at the evolution or devolution of the city-state in that period. In the 5th century, people said, we need to get money to go to the theater. In the 4th century, people said, it's not fair that we don't get paid to vote. You read 5th century literature, it's about war and politics and building the Parthenon. You read 4th century, it's about suing over disability payments. Lysias on the cripple. And so what happens in these situations where societies do not inculcate their values, they don't pay attention to tradition and protocol, they have no method of national education, they start to act irrationally, and they forget the very, very time-honored formulas that are kept alive through education that made them what they are. And they develop, because of their success, affluence, leisure, they develop this strange psychological tick that they have to be absolutely perfect or they're no good. And they have to have an equality of result rather than equality of opportunity. And when they get to that point, they self-destruct. And to be frank, they create nationals. They sort of undergo a national suicide. And it starts in the inability to transfer from one generation to the next what people are, who their parents were, what their values were, and more importantly, the very humble lesson that you do not have to be perfect to be good. Thank you very much.
Question?
We have time for maybe 3 or 4 questions, and if you could just come on up here, Dr. Hamilton will lead us off. If anyone has a question, if you could form a line behind Dr. Hamilton. We're going to say 3 or 4 to start because we do need to move things along. So, what's that?
I hope I could, I have 25 stitches in my mouth, so I hope I can speak well.
Just a comment that you have recovered wonderfully from your fall. If that was done after your fall, you did pretty darn well, I think.
Thank you.
Real quick question regarding the Bergdahl situation. Can you
Yes.
comment on that?
Well, I guess to cut to the quick, does anybody know one statement this administration said about the Bergdahl fiasco that was true? I don't. He was not captured on the field of battle. He did not serve with honor and distinction. There was not a need to hasten the process because he was ill. There was not a need because he was in mortal danger. Nobody believes that the 5 Taliban kingpins are not dangerous. Nobody believes they will be kept secure in a gutter for a year. We could go on, but I think the problem is that the administration used the Bergdahl for one reason. They wanted to get out of the Afghan war, that's understandable, and they had been negotiating with the Taliban, I guess to reduce it in the most cynical fashion. Basically the message was, we will do what is necessary for us to get out of town, and if you take Kabul in 2017, that's somebody else's problem. But whether it was cutting back the frequency of drone attacks or giving very valuable people to the Taliban in exchange for Bergdahl, it was for their sense, it was a rational move, and it also, as the president said, quote, whittled down the population of Guantanamo. If you take the 5 worst, then the next 50 are going to be much easier to get out. So it was an idea that news is bad, VA fiasco, IRS fiasco, et cetera, et cetera. Let's change the front page news, let's change the narrative. Let's say we can do a bin Laden raid, maybe only we'll do it in a humanitarian, we'll get the family out, we'll have the big PR thing. And it blew up in their face because they didn't do this, they're not educated and they didn't understand what Mr. Bergdahl had done. And one final thing, if I could, what got me angriest was this completely ad nauseum repetition. We always take our soldiers off the field of battle. We don't. Robert Garwood sat in Vietnam for 14 years because he had deserted. We didn't care where he was. In fact, when he came home, we court-martialed him. Christopher Jenkins, in 1965, Christopher Jenkins walked across the DMZ from the American Army because he didn't want to go to Vietnam, and he thought he had a great deal as a peacekeeper in Korea, and they were going to transfer him to Vietnam. So he walked across the DMZ and joined the North Koreans. You know what the attitude of the Johnson administration? Good riddance. And I'm not saying that and what happened? 40 years later, the Japanese marries the Japanese in North Korea, and the Japanese come to us and say, you left a guy in the field of battle. And they said, no, we didn't. He was a traitor. He's a deserter. And they said, well, can we bring him back? Yeah, you can bring him back. Well, what are you going to do? We're going to court-martial him. So we court-martialed him and dishonorably discharged. And then to have the President of the United States say, we always bring people back. I'm sorry, we don't. We had it happen in World War I. We've had it in World War II. It's not that we want to be punitive, but just if somebody leaves his comrades on the field of battle, we'll do what we can, but we're not going to give up 5 terrorists to bring him back and then lie and say that we always pay any price. That would be like saying, as I think it was Ben Shapiro wrote a good article saying, you know, Major Hassan is not served with honor and distinction because he joined the military at a time of war. He ended up killing people. But this is just, we're in a fantasy period now with this administration. Sorry about that rant. Go ahead.
You've done a great job of kind of identifying, you know, how we're all kind of in the fire, the battles, and the fires that fell here. Do you see anything on the political horizon, either or cultural horizon? Is there any glimmers or avenues of good news that we?
Well, there is. Yes. She asked, is there any good news, whether it's on the educational, academic, or the political front? And very briefly, on the educational, academic front, as you know, this model that I've outlined is not sustainable. Let's take the CSU. You cannot have a system in which administrative cost, overhead, increase the tuition above the rate of inflation, and then have the government float that deficit with student loans, and by the way, they're not low interest, they're 6 to 8% in many cases, and then have $1 trillion aggregate student loan with a 40% unemployment rate for recent graduates. That's unsustainable. It's dependent on the government subsidizing this fiasco. So not only psychologically, morally, ethically, educationally it doesn't work, but financially it doesn't. You see it. Every CSU campus, every UC has a DeVries, a Phoenix, they're popping up. And they're basically saying, We'll just cut to the quick. We want accounting, we'll give you accounting in 2 years. You want computers, and you know what? We don't offer GE. But big deal, they offer GE, but it's not GE. It's indoctrination, so why go through the motion? Just pay the money and get the degree. I don't agree with it, but it's very honest. So the internet, why does UC Berkeley need a classical philology journal that 7 people read per article for people to get tenure, when if you have an idea, put it on the internet? And you know, we don't really need to pay $85,000 a year for you to do research for 7 people to read. I mean, that's kind of cynical, but what I'm saying is the market, whether it's the internet or whether it's these trade schools, are starting to make adjustments. And it's not a sustainable situation where 50% of CSU students are graduating, only 50, and in 6 years with an increased debt. On the political sense, as you know, statistically, when you're in a second administration and you're in the midterm cycle, the dominant party and the party in the White House usually loses about 30 seats should the president's approval ratings be less than 50%. And so, yeah, so I think what we're saying is, I don't know what you is, but until this recent little mishap, I was going around, I'm going to New York tomorrow. You talk to people, and it's very reminiscent of 2010. And you get this feeling, there's a lot of people very quiet about it, they're very angry. But the people who are angry at this administration are, I think, going to vote, and the people who support it are sort of diffident or even defensive. So I think there's going to be some positive news in November with a Republican Senate, a larger margin in the House, and the $64,000 question will be, in reaction to that, the president, who is not fond of the Constitution, he's going to do these executive orders. So whether it's the Settle Law and the ACA Act that he just ignored, or whether it's completely undermining the immigration law, or whether it's ignoring the Congress on this swap, you're going to see that almost serially, daily. And the question will be, at what point will the Congress or the public step in? If his support gets below, I think the percentage to watch is 40%. He's got 39 to 41 sometimes, but should he go below 40%, you will see something. If he doesn't, I don't think he will. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. It seems to me that the administration's got a kind of a mega Cloward and Piven strategy going, where they've got us backed into the $17 trillion of debt and backed into so many corners. I've asked a lot of smart people the same question. I would ask you, is there any soft landing avenue for us if Obama, whenever he's out of office, or are we virtually assured of a hard time to come? Thank you.
Well, I think when he leaves, and if you had a Republican president, it would be a sense of catharsis, don't you? That you'd have all these CEOs and everybody said, wow, we can have a government that might have an oil or gas lease on federal land. Wow, we can frack in California. Wow, we might be able to build a reservoir again in California. Wow, there's a timber industry. I think you would have a national reawakening just from pin-up energy. I really do, and I think abroad our allies would say, you know what, we better not ankle bite a U.S. president like we have the last 2 or 3, because the result is you'll get somebody like Obama. So I feel that in so many spheres, people are getting tired of what he is, what he's done, what he wants to do, that should he leave, there'll be at least psychologically a period of rebirth. But that's a different question than you ask, and that is it fiscally possible? Do we have the wherewithal to get this debt down? And the problem with that is I'm a little bit more pessimistic, because there's never been a society that I know in Western history that voluntarily cut back on entitlements. So how do you get 50 million people off food stamps back to 30 million? It's going to be very difficult, because people, when they get an entitlement, feel always that that's a sign of weakness of the government that shows you that they feel guilty and they need more, not that they should have less. So you're going to have a revolutionary experience as you try to dial back unemployment insurance, food stamps, you try to rein in some of these, the EPA or the Department of Labor. That'll be very difficult. It'll be reminiscent of the Reagan bloodbath of his first 2 years. But it'll just depend on whether you have a Republican who wants to get along with people or a Republican who wants to be disliked. If you have a guy who wants to be disliked, we've got a chance. Thank you.